the figure of the nun in the Middle Ages, cloaked in a dark habit, with a rosary hanging from her belt and an expression that balanced divine serenity with the tensions of earthly life, is one of the most iconic images of medieval Europe. She represented a life of absolute devotion, sacrifice, and renunciation of worldly pleasures, wholly dedicated to prayer and service to God. However, this perception, deeply rooted in the mindset of the time, does not capture the complexity of female monastic life. Medieval convents were far more than sanctuaries of peace and spirituality. They were spaces where faith, power, human passions, and, at times, scandals intertwined in ways that challenged the ideals of sanctity. This account, with an informative tone and a touch of humor that remains serious, delves into the lesser-known side of nuns' lives in the Middle Ages, exploring the secrets, controversies, and episodes that made convents stages for intrigue, rebellion, and humanity at its fullest. Prepare for an extensive and detailed journey through the shadowy corridors of medieval convents, where sanctity often coexisted with the unexpected, the forbidden, and, in some cases, the downright surprising. Female monastic life in the Middle Ages has its roots in the early centuries of Christianity, when women like the consecrated virgins of the 4th century chose to renounce the world to dedicate themselves to prayer and contemplation. Inspired by biblical figures such as Mary Magdalene or Christian martyrs, these women laid the foundations for female monasticism. In the Middle Ages, convents became institutionalized under strict rules, such as those of Saint Benedict or Saint Augustine, which established the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as fundamental pillars. However, these rules, designed to free nuns from earthly ties, did not always manage to contain the complexities of human nature. Medieval convents were not just spiritual refuges. They were centers of power, culture, and, in many cases, intrigues that rivaled those of royal courts. Many nuns came from noble families, and their entry into the convent often responded to pragmatic rather than spiritual motives, preserving family wealth, avoiding unwanted marriages, or consolidating political alliances. This context, where religious vocation mixed with worldly interests, created fertile ground for situations that defied the ideal of sanctity. One of the most intriguing phenomena of medieval Europe was the double monastery, where monks and nuns shared the same complex, theoretically separated by walls and strict rules. The idea was practical. Monks provided spiritual services, such as celebrating Mass or administering sacraments, while nuns devoted themselves to prayer and contemplative life. However, physical proximity often led to encounters that were far from celestial. Historical records, such as those studied by the University of Salamanca in its analysis of Hispanic monasteries, document cases of nuns and monks crossing the lines of chastity, sparking scandals that echoed in courts and the Vatican. For example, in the 13th century, the monastery of Santa María de las Huelgas in Burgos, one of the most prestigious in the Iberian Peninsula, was the scene of rumors about inappropriate relationships between nuns and the chaplains who served them. Chronicles of the time, though often exaggerated by detractors of the Church, recount Episcopal visits aimed at correcting such behaviors. Picture a medieval bishop, with his mitre and crozier, entering the convent with the solemnity of a judge, reviewing records and interviewing nuns as they exchanged nervous glances, wondering who had let the gossip slip. These visits, though sometimes overstated in their impact, reflected the Church's concern with maintaining discipline in an environment where temptations were just a step away. Double monasteries were not the only settings for controversy. In many exclusively female convents, internal dynamics could be equally complex. Nuns, especially those of noble origin, often brought with them family rivalries or personal ambitions that did not vanish upon crossing the convent's threshold. In the 12th century, for instance, the convent of Santa María de Valbona in Catalonia was the scene of a conflict between two factions of nuns, one led by a noble-born mother superior and another by a group of nuns from humbler backgrounds. According to records from the period, the dispute began over differences in task assignments within the convent but soon escalated into accusations of favoritism and misappropriation of funds. The Mother Superior was accused of privileging noble nuns, granting them more comfortable cells and exempting them from arduous tasks like cleaning or working in the convent's gardens. The intervention of the local bishop was necessary to mediate the conflict, which was ultimately resolved with the removal of the Mother Superior and the imposition of new rules to ensure fairness. This episode, though not as sensational as others, illustrates how convents could be microcosms of the social tensions of the time, where class and power hierarchies persisted even beneath the habit. Power and money were another constant source of controversy in medieval convents. Elite convents, such as Santa Clara in Coimbra or Las Huelgas in Burgos, were true epicenters of influence. Many nuns were daughters of nobles or even kings, and their presence in the convent did not always imply a complete renunciation of their class privileges. These nuns managed properties, rents, and political connections that made them key figures in medieval society. However, this power came with temptations. A notable case, recorded in the archives of the Real Chancelleria de Valladolid, recounts how a nun in a Toledo convent in the 14th century was accused of diverting funds intended for charity to finance a lifestyle that included jewelry, fine fabrics, and even a personal retinue of servants. The investigation revealed that this nun was part of a network of religious women who negotiated with merchants and lent money at interest, a practice that, while common at the time, was seen as scandalous for a woman who had vowed poverty. The nun defended her actions, claiming she was protecting the convent's interests, an excuse that likely did not convince the bishop but demonstrates the cunning with which some nuns navigated a male-dominated world. This case illustrates how convents could become microcosms of intrigue, where nuns not only prayed but also negotiated, schemed, and, at times, confronted ecclesiastical authorities with audacity that defied expectations. Sexuality, a taboo subject in the medieval religious context, was another source of scandals in convents. The vow of chastity, though noble in intent, was not always easy to uphold, especially in an environment where emotions and desires had few outlets for expression. Medieval chronicles, though often veiled in euphemistic language, refer to cases of nuns maintaining relationships with clerics, nobles, or even other nuns. A fascinating example is the case of a nun in the convent of Sant'Angelo di Contorta in Venice, documented in the inquisitorial archives of the 14th century. According to the records, this nun, known as Sister Margherita, was accused of maintaining a romantic relationship with a Dominican friar who regularly visited the convent. The details of the case, though sparse, suggest the relationship was discovered when a fellow nun, driven by jealousy or moral zeal, reported the matter to the local bishop. The subsequent investigation led to the friar's expulsion and a punishment for Sister Margherita, which included a period of confinement in a penitential cell. This case, though not as well known as others, reflects the tensions that could arise in a cloistered environment, where proximity to male figures, whether chaplains or visitors, could give rise to rumors and scandals. Relationships between nuns, though even rarer in historical records due to the taboo, also existed. In the 13th century, the theologian and Bishop Albertus Magnus wrote about the need to monitor particular friendships in female convents, a euphemism likely referring to affectionate or sexual relationships between nuns. Though documented cases are scarce, records of episcopal visits to monasteries like Santa María de Valbona in Catalonia mention incidents of nuns sharing beds or maintaining intense emotional bonds, which raised suspicions among ecclesiastical authorities. In one particular case, a nun was accused of writing overly affectionate letters to a fellow nun, prompting an investigation by the bishop. Though the letters contained no explicit evidence of a forbidden relationship, the nun was punished with a period of isolation, reflecting the strictness with which the Church monitored interactions between nuns. These stories, though silenced by the Church, suggest that convents were not immune to human passions, and that nuns, like anyone else, sought ways to express their emotions in a restrictive environment. Not all medieval scandals were related to sexuality or money. Convents were also stages for internal power struggles, where nuns competed for control of the community or influence over ecclesiastical decisions. In the 12th century, for example, the convent of Santa María de las Huelgas in Burgos was the scene of a conflict between the Mother Superior and a group of nuns who opposed her leadership. According to historical records, the dispute began over differences in the interpretation of the Benedictine rule, but soon escalated into accusations of favoritism and abuse of authority. The Mother Superior, who came from a noble family, was accused of favoring certain high-born nuns in the allocation of tasks and resources, which created tensions within the community. The intervention of the Bishop of Burgos was necessary to restore order, but the episode made it clear that convents were not always oases of harmony, but spaces where power dynamics could be as intense as in any medieval court. Creativity also played a significant role in convent life, though sometimes in ways that sparked controversy. In the Middle Ages, nuns were often the guardians of written culture, copying manuscripts, composing sacred music, and creating religious art. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century German nun, is a standout example. Not only did she write sacred music that blended spirituality and creativity, but she also authored theological, scientific, and medical treatises, becoming one of the most influential figures of her time. However, her work was not without controversy. Some clerics of the period questioned a nun's authority to write on theological matters, and her mystical visions were scrutinized by the Church. Despite these criticisms, Hildegard gained the respect of popes and emperors, proving that nuns could be intellectual and cultural leaders, even in a male-dominated world. However, not all nuns had the support of powerful figures like Hildegard. In the convent of Santa María de Ripoll in Catalonia, an anonymous nun was reprimanded by the local bishop for spending too much time creating illuminated manuscripts, which, though beautiful, were considered a distraction from her spiritual duties. This episode reflects the tension between creativity and religious expectations that characterized convent life. Gastronomy was another area where medieval nuns left their mark, though not without controversy. Many convents produced sweets, liqueurs, and other goods sold to sustain the community. In the 13th century, the convent of Santa Clara in Naples was famous for its confections, which were sold to the local nobility. However, this activity drew criticism from some clerics, who argued that the nuns were too focused on commerce and not on prayer. In one particular case, a nun was accused of using the proceeds from these sales to acquire personal items, prompting an investigation by the local bishop. Though the case did not escalate into a major scandal, it illustrates how even the most innocent activities could become sources of conflict in the medieval context. Female monastic life in the Middle Ages was also marked by moments of resistance against external authority. During the 13th century, many nuns opposed church-imposed reforms, such as those aimed at enforcing stricter enclosure. In the convent of Santa Catalina in Barcelona, for example, nuns resisted a bishop's orders to limit their contact with the outside world, arguing that they needed to interact with the community to raise funds and maintain the convent. This resistance, though not always successful, shows that nuns were not passive figures but women capable of confronting established power, even in a context where their authority was limited. In one notable case, the nuns of Santa Catalina wrote a letter to Pope Innocent III requesting an exemption from enclosure rules, arguing that their convent depended on local community donations. Though the request was denied, the fact that the nuns dared to address the Pope directly demonstrates their determination and political organization. In conclusion, the life of nuns in the Middle Ages was a rich and complex tapestry, woven with threads of devotion, sacrifice, creativity, and humanity. The scandals, from forbidden romances to financial intrigues, are only part of the story, but they remind us that nuns, beneath their habits, were human beings with desires, ambitions, and contradictions. This account, far from being an attack on religious vocation, seeks to illuminate the lesser-known aspects of convent life in the Middle Ages, those that invite us to look beyond stereotypes. The next time you imagine a medieval convent, think of the stories those stone walls held for centuries. Stories of faith, struggle, and at times, a touch of mischief that made life, even in the cloister, profoundly human.